Hello everyone, today we continue our series about the traditional meaning of the patriciate. I already made one video about the topic. We fundamentally completed in some ways, provided that it's deeply intertwined with a wide net of history, religion, content that we're definitely expanding on step by step with no rush, right? This is important because it's spiritually effective, like to let this thing sort of sit in without, too much stress, like thinking about it. I don't know how you consume my content, but definitely this is an important way, like not to, I notice also with other type of videos, if I make something too close in time to one another, like there is sort of less effectiveness. Now, the distinction between plebeians and patricians. This aspect is metaphysical in nature, as you know, the world's hierarchy reflects the different layers, right, descending in the fall from God, from the celestial vault, right? So we notice how in different Catholic cultures, including the Roman one, the cult of the ancestors was more preeminently evident as, in this sense, publicly institutionalized among the patriciate, right? I recently made a video about the Concordia Ordinum that sort of discusses how, of course, when we look at these cultures, like in historical terms, there is all a degradation from very distant ancestral times that, as far as tradition goes, you could essentially rise back to God true, right? In that, however, we have to contextualize, because many people, when it gets to this kind of cultural differences, they presume that there is some sort of fixed culture that never changed. And this is mostly used not just to propose some kind of absolutistic sense of what one people is or was, conflating the entire, in fact, transformation along the period, but in this sense, in generating the sense of no difference, of, oh no, let's not focus on how and why these things came to be different at a point from one another, by which standards or whatever. We've seen how, in the video about the Concordia Ordinum, the possibility of elevating plebeians to the senatorial order was not merely a matter of sort of moral relaxation from the side of the Roman establishment. In many ways, it still underscored a fundamental traditional principle that is particularly evident in Roman culture, given the ensuing fulfillment of the Indo-European Evangelium in Catholic world domination by the Roman Empire. That is essentially the redeeming function that Holy War had in providing, in fact, the same plebeians, also by political and social background with imperial magistracies. So when in this video specifically we are talking now about patricians and plebeians, we're mostly looking instead at the archetypal difference between, the tendential difference between patricians and plebeians that did not exist just in Rome, right? And so when you look at the nobility and the commoners, the doctrine of cases, today we will mostly bring, in fact, examples from Rome and from the Vedas, right? Because that's sort of the most explicit kind of Indo-European evidence for this, but not the only one for sure at all. Indo-Europeistics, this is the word. If you presume that you can study whatever country, culture, people you come from without comparing Indo-Europeistics, good luck with, understanding literally anything about who your people is to begin with. In any case, the point here is that the distinction between patricians and plebeians wasn't rooted in the mere absence of, let's say, ancestors for the latter, meaning that even though the patriciate, of course, incarnated the establishment, the ruling estate, in the system, and therefore had this more prominently powerful divine metaphysical attachment manifested through their own force itself. The plebeians had something similar, right? It's not like there wasn't an ancestry sort of metaphysically recognized for the plebeians. The core difference laying instead in the nature of such lineage. That is to say, the plebeians, and so basically, and here we could draw brutal distinctions, but let's take the plebeians mostly as the full-blooded freemen, right? So a third estate more than else, and a fourth. So what can be considered as far as the slaves and the servants, and especially in the ancient world, there wasn't much of a difference. We will talk about this another time because people again like this categorical divides, right? Deriving from structuralistic. Is this actual slavery? If you don't understand the metaphysics of traditional religion, you cannot distinguish such things on, I don't know, socio-economical, political, juridical fashion. You have to make the enormous effort to try to understand how they actually thought the universe before even presuming to think that you can understand what a slave is according to them. Again, the main difference lacking in the fact that the third and the fourth estate lacked what in Latin was known as divi parentes, that is to say, the divine ancestors. Right? Imagine like divine parents, literally, because that's also where the term in English comes from. We're not going today to dive too much into etymologies, but this is also relevant because if you look at the Latin etymology of parents, this derives from the Italic pario, and the Proto-Indo-European pair that is connected with probably the concept of to produce, to beget, right? But if you look at the other cognates, for example, in Ancient Hellenic, or the same Umbrian, Italic Umbrian, Old Irish, Welsh, etc., interestingly enough, the etymology is connected with granting, bestowing, right? So not much just a genetic principle, but one that basically passes down and invests, right, with a specific power, a specific imperium. Think about in the Roman pater familias instance how, in fact, you had to be recognized by your father in a formal sense to be his son. So this was the moment in which your father bestowed on you such divinity. So now the difference again between patricians and plebeians was not much this connection, but the fact that the patricians were the only ones to have divine ancestors. And if you look at the videos that I made about the traditional meaning of afterlife and the victory over the second death by the most important soul of the individual, so not one of the person that basically died. You know that persona in Latin means mask, basically. And the totemic one still was to remain connected with earth, with the soma in the decomposition, etc. But going back to the totem of the ancestor, which is sort of reblended in something else. But the second soul, the most important, this one was judged, and basically by winning over the second death, really, which could be profiled by the failure in passing this judgment, earned its shot in the firmament, right? At a part of the firmament, right? But one that radically divided from earth, departed from earth, and therefore entered the ranks of the heavenly army, right? And that would have had to be summoned once again in the end time. So the radical difference between patricians and plebeians laid in this. Inasmuch patrician families were the only ones whose forebears were considered divine. This is really crucial. Essentially, the plebeians did not have ancestors whose second soul made it by merit and virtue and works to pass the test of the second death by God, obviously enough. And therefore, these people were destined, without the intervention of higher read Patrician, in fact, souls and blood, to be saved in a broader picture, and basically would just vanished, right, and degraded further like anything belonging to the lower nature. Remember always the doctrine of the two natures, that is the foundation of this all. So no sacred or transcendent qualities were passed down through the plebeian bloodline, right? It's not like this life, of course, did not have an inherent potential to accomplish so, because at every generation, we made an example before, between, say, the Patricians and plebeians, but also in as much as the plebeians were also provided with the imperium to succeed into this firmament offshoot, so to say, which, if anything, stresses the stark divide between, in fact, the transcendental achievement, right, and the failure, basically, of those who wouldn't have it. So the plebeian existence wasn't shaped by a form, right? Remember, in the doctrine of the two natures, important between the form that is transcendental and the substance that is basically the fallen product. So that you can have a lot of substance, like in the, as we'll see now, also in the European powers, the idea of the giants, of the monsters, of the titans, but not having a form, an order, a reason, right? And therefore succumbing. As you understand, this connects very deeply with the concept of command as well, because if you don't have this transcendental understanding, you don't have a divine wisdom as well, and therefore, and we talked about this in the videos about the ancient war bands, you could not really lead these other elements. And so not providing what was needed, that is a form to the substance, to actually create for the plebeians in this case to also transfigure themselves. This is incredibly important because if you look at what Rome did, it's the same thing, like a war band on a larger scale. And exactly with this transcendental capacity of creating a God-chosen people, it was already chosen, but also in virtue of their merit, through this very specifically hierarchical form, and of course the substance of the people as such, that was in this sense superior to all the other peoples, regardless of the internal division between patricians and plebeians. This is very important because it makes you understand to an extent also how differently intertwined, also later the Roman citizenship, etc., all the concepts of merits and power were compared to the level of nobility involved. Right. This is very interesting. It intertwines also with a lot of medieval law. Consider always the Romano-Germanic principle of freemen that equates to the one of noblemen. To an extent, right? He who bear arms is endowed with this faculty of command that he will essentially exercise on somebody else. For example, this third estate had slaves, and thus they would command these guys, and so they had some kind of cultivating, manumitting power on their own that sort of reflected even what the patricians had compared to them, right? So it's all very compacting in a social logic. And that's why the patrician form, so to say, was preserved through strict esoteric rituals, because they belong to a divine accomplishment, a divine dimension that this establishment had achieved through their virtue, spiritual power, and that therefore informed the entire religious practice of, in this case, of Rome, but it could be again of the other Indo-European peoples as well, and not all. Without the authority that enabled aristocrats to conduct their own exclusive religious rites, that we described, if anything, in the former part of this series, because we explain how and why these rites are important, why tradition insists on the sacraments in the way they are administrated. It's not a random thing. Really, it could be surpassed, but only if you have that actual result tangibly evident, not just by wishful thinking. Okay, so I bail out of rituals because I don't think like average people now can make it work. And can you do anything better, actually? Right? This is how the world is being gradually collapsing all the way. In any case, this authority served through religious rites, also the same priestly estate. This is seen, for example, in the ancient classical world, among the Norse, the Germanic tribes, also the Far East. Again, there are different instances properly of this nobility that is still sort of subdivided in part towards more or less priestly duties. Again, the Romans had, for example, in their magistracies some specific religious functions, more or less pronounced, coming together with the imperium and other prerogatives. So you could have really a superimposition. This is a very delicate topic as far as, how much was the first estate blend with a second, and how conventional is this distinction. So without the transformative second birth that defined the Arya, that is the noble, as emphasized in the Manava Dharma Shastra, in various parts, for example, to 172. Similarly, there is some reference to this before 157, 58, also 103 and 39 if you go backwards, so to say. And this work is also like the Manava Dharma Shastra is known as the Manus Mirti, or Laws of Manu, right? It's this ancient legal and ethical text, part of the Dharma Shastra tradition, dated roughly between 200 BC and 200 AD. Naturally, here everything is informed by the Vedic legacy, so that's why we studied this thing to begin with, and that's obvious in the Indian tradition. In any case, the work outlines social, moral, and legal studies for individuals and the communities, emphasizing caste roles, rituals, the spiritual hierarchy, as we were looking at, and it describes the duties of the four varnas that are the castes. It has stages of life, the ashramas, with the aforementioned passages that we just cited, stressing essentially the need for a second birth through initiation to elevate an Arya noble above the Shudra status. As I understand, this is a duty, right? The fact that you are born an Arya doesn't actually mean that you are simply going to maintain that by, zoological materialism. Any action will either increase or decrease your divinity and transcendental power. If anything, we will not talk about genetics here according to tradition, but it's obvious that the qualities of the ancestors were transmitted through their fuses, and so you are basically that at birth, and you come, of course, with all kind of further influence that has been already modeling you in the process, but of course you have power to achieve in life, which is up to you at that point. Of course, the world that surrounds you, but still. And this, the Manava Dharma Shastra declares that an Arya remains no better than a Shudra until reborn. Where the Shudras, well, the Indian caste system outlined in this text, the Shudra is the lowest of the four Varnas castes. Shudras were traditionally associated with manual labor, service, and occupation supporting the higher castes. Remember that work in tradition pertains to slaves. There is no such thing like, you're a freeman and you actually work, which is also part of the reason, again, what we said before, that the Roman, in theory, was also a farmer, etc., but more like a supervisor of slaves, because as a warrior, he could simply lord over these guys. This is, we get beautiful passages from Hellenic poetry describing the Celts exactly in the same ways, etc. So it was just inherent, the concepts of leadership. And the other cases, were the Brahmins, were the essentially the priesthood that in the Vedic tradition was more important than the kshatriyas, or at least there was a specific distinction, because as we've seen also in the Roman case, it's as if they were overlapping, not just in the Roman one, in the Vaishyas that were essentially the third estators. And so lacking divine lineage or access to sacred rituals and initiations, the Shudras were considered spiritually and socially inferior, barred from certain religious practices and higher roles in society for the same exact reason that we just outlined. Their ancestors had not made it into heaven, so they were just some sort of lower form of being that was stuck, in a sense, on earth, not essentially contributing to that specific threshold that allows humanity to essentially become mankind and transcend at a divine level, earning a place in the firmament. And I was about to complete the phrase, the Arya remains himself no better than a Shudra until he is reborn, meant in the second death, right? That is, after that, during this judgment. And this is kind of obvious, because what is crucial here is that, of course, say humanity, as long as we're talking mortals and the earthly dimension, is still, biologically speaking, under the threshold, right? So the fact of having had ancestors that made into heaven doesn't mean that you made it into heaven, right? There is, as we were describing also in other videos, always a connection between, again, the successful, so to say, the divine ancestors and the, as we said before, the totemic somatic bulk, right, of the clan, that is also an underworldly deity, the manas, the penati, etc. That's part of the Roman version of the story, for example. Those constantly reinform you in the same way. But indeed, the guy who has transfigured is also like in that spiritual dimension beyond, and you aren't. So you can't be born an Arya, but according to this Indian text, of course, you are not better than an actual slave, because just you're a human until you pass the test. This is incredibly important also for an obvious reason that is readily apparent on the basis of the fact that India was by far the most caste-based system of this all. I mean, if we were serious really about objective history, also basically any other Indo-European society was very much fixated on this. Think about the Roman orders, the medieval estates. We're looking at the same identical thing, but of course it's not like throwing the term caste around. Caste is something that, you think it just for India, right? That is peculiar and weird and whatever, but actually the entire picture that this people's reason through was by degrees of capacity of power that, as we've seen, is also a bit like civilization is organized, right? There are just a handful of people who actually are in control compared to the mass. And so these stages are to be functionally understood in an approximate sense. But in a metaphysical one, it's also true that, again, the great discriminant is mortality. You can be nobleman and mortal as much as you could be, in fact, like someone born from a lower dimension. Think about Mithras, that is born a stone. So literally the lowest level of basically quasi-zero life. And we also explained in other videos how, especially in the one on the traditional doctrine of space, everything is actually alive in the world. Because if it exists, it's because there is some trace of life potential. And that's also what, in fact, the entire Mithraic myth is about. It's like passing from a stone to the sun himself, so God himself. So this text quite remarkably points that out, that you say you can even act as if you were, as you are, definitely superior to somebody else, but if you don't take that step, it's as if you weren't from that side. And it's beautiful because it sort of highlights the importance of this gate to divinity. That is not merely a matter of, simply wishful thinking or simple being or doing nothing, of course, but actually connected with the with a doctrine, with a ritual, with a passage, in fact, a new life, and the real life, the only life. Untouched by three celestial fires that in ancient Iran embodied the spiritual essence of the empire's three highest classes, and missing the solar essence that marked the Inca caste in ancient Peru, plebeians faced no barriers to mingling freely either. Right? It was more sexual promiscuity, and we know this, that archetypally, anthropologically is true. That the lower element is dirtier, less pure, less moral, because it spoils this inherent primacy. That's what's the importance, for example, of chastity, of virginal, primogenital power, right? All of this. And so you understand also how these cases highly safeguarded their genetics, all right? Marriage, offspring, were incredibly or radically important mechanisms to preserve those genetic qualities. And it seems to me really undeniable that this is still self-evidently, even in our incredibly degraded society, the same thing. You can immediately sense who is more and who is less in this picture. And by characters that are, let's say, at least, it's not like they're unconventional, but they are not at least explicitated in our culture by such, because we have been essentially told that everybody's equal, that there is no such thing like a positivity in difference, if anything. And so that is a problem in and of itself that distracts ourselves ever more from the ultimate logic that literally lives within our veins, right? So this is an interesting, especially from the Iranian tradition, because I received, if you remember, in some of the last Q&A series, lots of questions about the tradition. I'd say how important was ethnicity in ancient Iran, how much the Persians saw themselves as the master race of the Achaemenid Empire, etc. This is it, right? The Iranians thought that, of course, there were the three highest classes of embodying the spiritual essence of the empire were represented by, in fact, by the Iranian people within that order. And so it's literally what I was saying before about the Romans. It's not like if you were a plebeian Roman, as a freeman, as a Roman citizen, as a legionnaire, say, you were merely just like a universal third estate. No, you belonged to a master race, to a chosen, to the highest people of all, and therefore, even as a plebeian, by being a Roman, you were inherently superior, at least on average, to most other third estaters recognized as such in other within other ethnicities that pose themselves hierarchically and corporately being very different and subordinated ways to the great, essentially feudal Roman imperial order. Right, we tend to forget about this. Think about how often you've been told that the Roman Empire was a place where nobody cared about race, where everybody was equal, the rights were the same. If you just took the thing, well, except for slaves, but never mind. But as if Romanity was just like this weird red blob spread with no other difference across different peoples, races, ethnicities. No, right? There is a radical principle of superiority and inferiority that is genetically based and that witnesses, in fact, the Romano-Italic peoples lording over the entire world as a master race compared to the others, because, of course, they had in this fulfilled the divine prophecy that also was recognized, by the way, by other peoples. Other peoples in antiquity reasoned in those terms, right? They had specific prophecies telling that there would be different stages, as you know, of mankind corresponding to different states, different different empires properly, different dominations, right? And Romanity embodied the resurgence of the Golden Age between the Third and the Fourth Age, and that's also something that Christianity grafted on, obviously, because Augustus ruled during Christ's birth, etc. So it's something really mutually informing this Catholic order. And as we've seen, this is understood also pretty far away. We talked about the Incas recently, speaking of their terrifying 16th century fate. But of course, these were traditional societies, and in their own way, they had exactly this aspect, like the plebeians in the Inca caste system lacked the solar essence, so the divine ancestry of the higher estate, right? Their ancestors had not made it to heaven, and so as a demographics, there were just this lesser elements crawling in the world, gradually dying out, and just part of their clanic somatic totem regenerating at death in part, because some life continues also in the third soul that goes, in fact, in the nether world, inferically wise, and so, but it's always the same actual mechanism that we've seen elsewhere. This is just for saying that we're not just talking Indo-Europeans, but why do I say that? Because it's just like in other instances, different scale. You can make this comparison across the globe, even without the Indo-Europeans. But the Indo-Europeans are by far, for different moral, political, and cultural reasons, the ones that were more overwhelmingly historically documented in the history of religion, also because we documented ourselves at some point comparatively diachronically. And it's not like, you have a better grasp about, say, the Chinese tradition that is also fairly extensively documented and recovered, fortunately enough. But however, compare now to the Germans or to the Romans. Also, as we've seen, the Indian tradition is very strong. Let's say if we look at the Incas, it's obvious that we know a few, but that very few tells us, surprise, surprise, the same exact thing of what we know in greater depth for these other peoples. Now, there is also this approximate definition that could go as far as saying that plebeians possess no distinct cult of their own, at least in a truly ancestral sense. In a deeper one, in fact, had no father. Right? Think about this in the contemporary crisis, family crisis. Right? The lack of a fatherly figure in the house, or actually, as we're discovering, at any genetical level, like you literally need to be raised by your own biological parents to be functional. Like it's being studied that, so mother-wise, if you are not grown with your mother next to you, your own specific mother, you're not going to develop certain functional characteristics. And I'm very sorry to say this, for there are beautiful adoptive parents, etc. So, but unfortunately, science tells us something very strong. It is to say, there is a transfiguring power within genetic continuity, right? It cannot simply be exchanged, and so this is part of the gateway to spirituality. And don't worry, by the way, because it's not like you're rigged. As we know, as long as there is life, there is a possibility of attaining divinity, right? And earning your place to heaven, right? And surely many people did with some horrifying sort of premises, in their case. But as far as the wall is concerned, the idea that we look at this subculture where the family doesn't count anymore, and the father is an optional, etc. Well, as Livy in his histories of Rome 10:8 say, literally, patrem quire non possunt. All right, these people are unable to invoke their father. right? Which can erase all the bad jokes, like you don't know what your your father is, etc. I remember, okay, I can't say that maybe, but those kind of means, like, our we were kings. It's like my ancestor, like he was like this pharaoh. You don't even know who your father is. Sorry, I know. I have really terrific African American, especially followers. They deeply cherish, and I absolutely know that they are against any kind of sort of that kind of black supremacistic interpretation of things, because they are on Schwerpunkt. But this is, again, jokes aside, very, very, very important. It's something that pertains, in fact, to every culture. We could find many examples of this everywhere, so proving, in fact, that it's not distinctive of specific cultures, that can change over time. And the traditional ones definitely have this idea. Think about this: possessing no distinct cult of their own, and in a sense identity, because you don't have a father, right? In the metaphysical principle, the father is the godfather, and so, as we were saying before, he represents the form, all right? Whereas the mother represents the substance, and she is, in this sense, as we also explained in the video about the recent, like the Indo-European Urfolk and the rejection of this, or better, the actual subjugation of the civilization of the mother, that of course these two models cannot go separated. They would be self-referential. In order to attain divinity, the father must possess the mother and ingravidate her and rule over her. This is the actual secret to divine perpetuation, regeneration. This is what the entire system is based on. So this is incredibly, incredibly important. And again, as we'll understand now, it's not like the plebeians did not have cults on their own. Hell, they had, right? And they were, in this sense, much more promiscuously heterogeneous and changing, in fact, because they were in the lower element that degenerates faster in tradition than the higher one of the patres, right? That is, of course, by being closer to God, less changeable. It's like in Dante's comedy, the highest heavens are ever less mobile, right? Because they approach perfection. And so the unmoved mover, right? Just speak Aristotle. But both Aristotle and Plato, regardless of differences, they're actually telling in two different styles of the same identical thing. Nevertheless, these plebeian cults were not intended to have the same dignity, right? If we were speaking in Latin, the dignitas, like these were all, everything ending as these were different virtues. And the virtues, of course, belong to the higher castes. The plebeians could have some specific traits, but in this sense, they were not intended to be as high as the others. We've seen this also, speaking of gentes of plebeian ancestry with lower, say, humbler origins. We made a video about Marcus Porcius Cato, for example, and you say that the gens Porcia, in that sense, it's literally after the pork, it's after pigs. They had this lower chthonic animal totems that were just like farm animals or something like that. So that tells you how they were genetically conceived. And this is interesting because Cato, of course, is like the prototype actually of the Roman senator, the true Roman. And that literally mirrors what we were telling before about the fact that still as a Roman, even as originally coming from this lower estate, still at least any in origin, because they were evidently very powerful in his era. I made a video specifically about him and his achievements, were part of a higher race of Romans, in this sense, like sharing like some broader genetic solidity from their ancestry in that particular Romano-Italic history. But again, Livi patrem Kieran possunt is pretty bitter, painful, but also beautiful statement regarding the fact that this divine fatherhood, and of course, as you know, divine pertains to the god father as such, like by definition, was exactly intended in this virile fashion. So that notoriously, like the plebeian cults in Rome, that's where we're much more agrarian, we're much feminine. Think about Charis, think about all like also more Dionysian elements, right? But obviously had this pre-Indo-European substratum that we've seen in the video about the mother civilization that was more communistic, feministic in tendency, or even just by political social trend compared to the much more brutally and rigidly conservative patrician nobility. Now, going back to the Vedic tradition, according to the Brahmanas' mythical account of caste origins, each of the three upper castes is linked to a specific divine class. The Shudras, we've seen, have no such divine counterpart, right? Leaving them without a deity to worship or sacrificed to, and barring them from using sacred marriage formulas, the mantra. Think also how in the Judeo-Christian tradition we are, again, in the same identical sphere, also from the medieval, again, works of Dante and all other great, thinkers, theologians, and traditionalists, and imperial supporters, by the way, that, in fact, in the same heaven, there are different ranks of angels that have a different color, have a different meaning, different name. These ranks are exactly the ranks of these heroes, right? They're of these elements that have not much just fallen from God originally, but also have and populated the earth to a degree by notoriously also copulating with the lower, the fallen monsters, right? And hence also that reminiscence of the Indo-European conquest of the, of the pre-existing and different sense of masculinity that existed in this, at some point, Gynecocratic societies, or, where the priesthood was administered by women, etc. Big but dumb. This is present in every single Indo-European mythology. Speaking of those men that weren't, however, men in that dignified sense, in fact. And there is no such thing, obviously, for, in fact, the fourth estate. In fact, the fourth estate represents exactly those subjects of this of the higher order. And in India, this left specifically the Shudra caste without a deity to worship or sacrifice to, and barring them from using sacred marriage formulas, the mantra. This is also in particular relevant because we do know that marriages existed, but they were not sanctified. All right, they were, by the convention of the ruling castes, just less. It's as if an animal had, and that, especially as we'll see now, as far as the, in fact, chthonic prevalence in India of the doctrine of reincarnation, mixing a bit those cyclical eternal spirals of feministic chthonic order. In fact, as often always basically happens in India, like swallow basically any other conqueror to some degree, given the enormous demographic pool to control, are, again, the proof of a lesser element. Moreover, as a result, the plebeian religious practices were inherently collective and tied to chthonic forces, as we've seen. So the lower element went in parallel with this more socialistic bias of theirs. That was also a corporative way to go. Again, if you look at how even Rome was ruled, of course, there were different collegia. There were powerful third estates, as we said before. Because here we see also like some sort of in between, like what is, we said originally, what is actually a third estater or fourth estater? Working, also ideally, yes, if you work, you're a slave, but what does it mean in a context when there is a third estate, for example, that provides with, logistical support, craftsmanship, etc. The system had always worked, the systems had never worked positively, right? There was essentially, if you look at the great, for example, Indo-European migrations, you realize that the civilizations being born out of that sort of took control of the situation in the world to this day that no other, let's say, system had achieved, at least since the age of gods. And considering the generally declining pattern of the other civilizations, the previous civilizations in the process. So again, this is very complicated. It sort of delves also into prehistory. I recently made some other Indo-European history content, and we'll talk about that. But what I was saying is that, of course, also that component was corporatively integrated into traditional hierarchy. You would have not had, again, a Roman manipular legion without third estators, provided that, as we explained, these were still considered citizens, gradually considered citizens with the power of bearing armies, so with an imperium bestowed also, in fact, on the plebeian magistracy, as we've seen in the video about the Concordia Ordinum. So, again, there is a level of ambiguity regarding the exact boundaries of estates, and especially depending on which peoples we're talking about. For example, in India, the plebeian religious practices took the form of ecstatic, frenzied rituals often rooted in the pre-Aryan cultural layers. In other countries where, for example, the Indo-European influence had been stronger at the demographic, cultural, moral level, of course, things were very different. You don't see in Europe anything like in India that, again, retains a traumatically large amount of pre-Indo-European and feministic and theonicistic practices and cults. Something you see, I don't know, look at, you can find these differences between peoples. Look at the Romans compared to the Greeks, for example. The Greeks, by the time the Romans took them over, had essentially derailed. I made a video about the rise and fall of the Hellenic civilization towards some sort of more Dionysian and Chthonic, Pelasgian, feministic, contemplative, asceticistic the dimension. Again, it's not like the Greeks had lost their primal sort of Dorian patriarchal virile nature. Again, in the East, they were the master race in the lands conquered by Alexander. It's also the Romans would treat them as their kin, always subordinated, of course, to them to themselves. But again, there is a disparity, probably a moral temper between peoples that can help you, in fact, address better what kind of level of divine transcendency existed in this rule among these rulers. In Mediterranean societies, as we've seen in the video about the Indo-European Urfolk, the plebeians centered on the pre-Aryan cult of the mothers and subterranean powers. This is true also, for example, in Western Europe. If you look, for example, at the Celtic world, or even in some areas that were gradually taken over by the Indo-Europeans, were strong chthonic elements remaining. Think about specifically in the Gaelic mythology, you realize that there is a very strong substratum remaining standing. You see in Gaul with certain deities dedicated to the harvest, to grapes with feminine elements, etc. The Romans, for example, were actually more Apollonian, more heavenly than that, just in their normal leading culture as such. So it's rare and difficult. Like, it's not like the Gauls. Fair King Etasrix was not into a Apollonian cult of course, of its own nobiliar background, but that there are different degrees by which different cultures are also able to recuperate this, and also to the degree they had partially blended with, to the degree they had, for example, demographically blended with other peoples. This is the case of Iberia, that, for example, is heavily influenced by Indo-European culture. There are Celtic migrations, etc. But there's also a big deal sort of non-Indo-European substratum. In any case, when you look at these plebeian cults, you pretty much realize everywhere, it's like the lefties today, everywhere, that they have this sort of feministic and communistic mentality contrasting even as with models, like, again, not necessarily female, but also sometimes feminine men, and this lower, socially lower, more degraded, more squalid, more vulgar, more popular element compared in contrasting with the radiant, heroic, and Olympian traditions that we will talk later, that again embodied by the rigidity of patriarchal order and leadership. Known as children of the earth in ancient Rome, remember that human derives from humus, so from dirt, which is the earth, so hence human as opposed to man. The viri that were connected historically also with the sense of rule. For example, valeo in Latin stands for being strong, from vis roboris, but the etymology of the term, if you look at the Indo-European etymology, is the same one of rule. They have the same root word. It's literally the same sound in the original, just in different languages, different. So it was not just being strong, but fit for rule. In that sort of God gives you the Holy Ghost, the imperium virtue of your own deeds, right? And instead, the plebeians were primarily connected to feminine earth deities. Again, not only, because this is never like a categorically separated thing, but it is obviously from a tendential point of view. All right. For example, like you can see this also in the Hellenic pantheon. There are some deities that are some more obviously Aryan in origin, and they are Apollonian, Olympian, celestial, and they are blonde, blue-eyed. If you look at Athena, if you look at Apollo, etc., they are obviously part of the Indo-European leadership. If you look at Demeter, which literally whose name, as we've seen in the video about the Indo-European and the rejection of the Great Mother, comes from Gemeter, so literally from Mother Gaia, but Mother Earth. Everything takes on another character, right? The Pelasgian elements, the sea, at least in Greece, that was very important for many reasons, but you can see the blend there, and the characteristics, the features being sort of more in that Pelasgian dimension, shifting towards the chthonic, the abyssal. So this is incredibly important. Similarly, we find stuff like this in China, or at least in its surroundings as well. For example, the aristocratic state religion, especially in the imperial China, so in the Qin, everything laying under heaven, that's the etymology of China, was countered by the practices of those labeled to be possessed, right? If not infected, some sort of zombie apocalypse, right? Known as the Lingbao, which were also associated, in fact, with lesser peoples at an international level, such as the barbarian Mongols, who followed shamanic folk traditions that, as you know, were deeply imbued with Dionysian trances and so on. It's sort of incredibly disturbing how there are people out there who are trying to make, also for Europeans, shamanism passing as some sort of, not as a degeneration of traditional Catholic rule as existed in among all these peoples, but some sort of primal stage, or actually pristine stage of these cultures' religious development. All right, this is insane, right? Shamanism, of course. If you look at Tengrism, of course, there is the entire spectrum there, from properly heavenly rule to the lower shamanic aspect. And again, they were not separated. This is true. But because there was a lesser element in society that needed that frenzied shamanic trance to be enacted, it's just think about how the Orphic cults, Dionysian, again, in Hellas, existed next to Olympian worth, but by how much greater degree by the time the Romans, for example, took over Greece, right? It's incredibly important to stress. But again, in China, it's interesting that, of of course, shamans were seen as this lesser element, as opposed, of course, to a universal imperial Catholic rule. Now, in ancient Germanic cultures, the aristocracy's supernatural status was a recurring theme. All right, we'll come back to this prepotently, and we already made so many videos, especially documenting Germanic warfare, that in many ways was all about that. If you look at the etymologies of Germanic names, you realize how more strictly military in character they are. Right? If you look at the Roman ones, for example, they're more metaphysical to some. I mean, they're very metaphysical in the same Germanic military meaning of that, but they're more abstracted from that almost strictly technical dimension. I mean, in Latin, you would have never had a name like Wilhelm, for example, right? So integrating even properly pieces of weapons into that, which would have been considered, as you know, also a fallen thing in many ways, compared to, in fact, the ingenus. And again, don't get me started on Indo-European etymology, because I love those, and there are deeper principles like rejecting the material element as opposed to this transcendental element. Ingenus, literally in Latin, that meant free, meant also soft in the core, which according to the doctrine of the fall, but also incarnation in that sense, suggested that the higher beings were actually, from a physical point of view, not harder, right? Harder in tradition stands from more sclerotic, more dead, and this is what we well know also basically at every level of biology, tissues speaking, or whatever. And again, there are so many ways to connect this with everything we know scientifically, to the point that tradition is backed by everything that we know so far. In any case, the Germans surely were that invested in that brutal reactivation. Sometimes was also Dionysian. Tacitus talks about, in fact, those part of those shamanic practices as well, involving also the mimicking of horse racing frenzy. The horse was admittedly like a dual symbol, both chthonic and heavenly, because it in fact brought the rider either down or up, depending on what happened in holy combat there. And it's true to an extent that the Germans, being less socially stratified, had actually for that reason more difficulty for aristocracies to rise to a degree, and naturally living in poorer areas, having less surplus, etc. Let's say it's not immediately evident, aside from especially the further aristocratization and dynastization that occurred in later in late antiquity, for example, also because of the Romans, for example, creating an adequate frame for Gothic leaderships, ancestry and genealogy, etc. It's more difficult to describe like the earliest Germanic kingship. That, however, we know fairly a lot through, in fact, the same classical sources, and especially the Romans, that also felt a lot of affinity to this practice. That they took the German, as you know, as some sort of, not good savage model, but again, in fact, some idea of this is how we were when we weren't spoiled, kind of, to a degree, even though we have achieved now more. We are, by this time, more powerful. Well, they were right. Tacitus literally saying, like, just look at what happened to other empires. This is what will happen over and over again. It was part of, again, of the world prophecy. The great powers declining irreversibly to something ever more fractal and destroyed. Look at us. How many states? How few universal authority to begin with. But we also have enough information, of course, about the Germans, especially in their prehistorical dimension, that we don't have, unfortunately, for most other Indo-Europeans, especially in the saying the Germans have. And in this, you must thank the Romans, you must thank the early medieval Christian authors. We know that Germanic leaders doubled also as priests for their people in territories, not always, by the way, but also, and especially for today's video's sake, the obvious descent from a divine figure that set certain families apart, from whom kings were traditionally selected. And this can be found in different ways. By the way, the myth is always the same. The emergence from the water, think about ink. It's just like, Moses and Romulus and Remus, the touch of the spear, some initiation. Think about the wolf descending from the mountain, that is the Olympus. I made a video specifically about Livy's or tale, the origin of Rome, that is literally there, a pure manifest of Indo-European evangelical world domination there through the same war-banding practices. Well, the Germans really provide with a lot of that, including also, as we were saying before, the fringes of the world is sometimes sort of chthonic mix. For example, Merovec, the founder, in fact, of the Merovingian dynasty, was supposed to be, as the etymology of the name says, was a sea monster of some kind, of sea cow, right? So that, for example, sounds like a very Pelagian thing to begin with. Again, never underestimate how darker. Think about the crow as opposed to the eagle. Again, both symbols existed, but let's say how this northwestern world was actually more French, but also likely preserving more, in fact, Dionysian enacting practices for elevating to the celestial dimension. I made a video explaining this. The ancients called it the way of the left hand, and it had to do with walking on the edge, basically where the fire of that blazed. As those in, say, that first step into the hierarchy that also the plebeians, as we've seen, could take part of in different ways, in war bands as in the Roman army, the same thing, was necessary to augment, like to be integrated, if anything, with an Apollonian dimension to be fully successful. You couldn't attain divine transfiguration without this lower element. Doesn't matter how subordinated it was in command, in hierarchy, in quality to the higher one. That's why you had to be able to handle both. And we explained again in the previous video how and why, for example, like in this case, in a more primitive and thus simpler society, the Germans, for example, would maintain the, say, this greater promiscuity between the first and the second order, power-wise. Again, it's not a problem, actually. The Romans were, as we've seen, through their magistracies, partially the same, sharing them occasionally as well, through a patrician order that had been formed with the so-called republic, driven away from a single monarchic rule of the same. In fact, that's also the maintenance of unitary power that, however, in Germany was so difficult, as we've seen, to maintain at a higher level. But this is like how, like, even a head of family could officiate certain family rites. This is something, honestly, in my family was also a thing, literally. And I'm surprised by how recent and alive it actually is, right? This endowed the leader, in any case, the king, if you want, at the highest level, with a unique dignity, distinct from that of the, for example, of the current military leader, the dux, the eritigo, chosen, if anything, temporarily for wartime exploit based on proven skill. Technically, this could be literally the same person, but the visots, the highest leader, was considered also as a skilled leader of men, also, yes, through his military curriculum, but mostly having acquired that prestige already based on his ancestors' achievement. In Tacitus' Germania, there is an extensive reference to this dichotomy, as far as there were peoples who had once been very good at war, but now had basically proven what they were, and they could sort of relax. While there were more rampant, young, aggressive tribes that had still to prove that, right? But this was sort of more temporary. So what was settled as an imperium legacy, as a proof of force, like, was not to be messed up because it had divine ancestry. Otherwise, you still had to prove yourself to some other extent. Ancient Norwegian kings, for instance, performed rituals independently without reliance on a separate priesthood. Even in So-called primitive societies, those who remained uninitiated, were deemed the barbarians of their communities, excluded from the clan's political and martial privileges. Remember what we discussed, like the race of the without kings, right? That were exactly the rituals performers, as they were essentially the media of and with God, without therefore anybody in between. And this is also what we've seen being basically the concept of sacred royalty, that could be in fact more or less mediated. Like if you pick, for example, I don't know, the Roman magistracies, the power in the Roman Empire, even the fact that the emperor was the medium, but did not in fact officiate literally all the rites. If anything, the most important from which the others derived fair. But let's say you have, for example, in the Germanic world that is more politically fractal, different kings that do basically this on their own, and it's not like in fact they have anybody above them. Relation with God's wise that sort of interfere in that. So it's interesting because they also literally have less power, and so this tells you how the corporative, imperial, Catholic idea, of course, is the one that delivers more power. That's why the old Saxons that practiced this cult, like, were taken over by a Charlemagne, right? Part of a way more organic system of, broader Franco-Roman civilization in the High Middle Ages. We're talking a completely different civilization by scale and advancement. But this is exactly what the point of the greater empire really was, as far as also the necessity of a sole authority called to rule the world by God himself, that in theory should have in fact been the same guy in charge, hence the Augustan Sebastocratic ideals of divine rule. We were talking about this the other day also in the video about 7th century Byzantine imperial spirituality, but also talking about the emperor's role and how he was portrayed, for example, at that time, following the same exact theology. Now, prior to rites designated to, quote, fundamentally transform their nature, often involving grueling trials and periods of seclusions, individuals weren't regarded as true men. They were lumped together with women, children, or even animals, right? We haven't discussed in this sense how, for example, the woman, the offspring, really played as far as the man was concerned. In many ways, they were considered just like his own extension through the sacrament of marriage and the recognition, in fact, as we've seen before, of that offspring as properly the divinely blessed ones. This is incredibly important. Besides, on the notion that a specific transition rite was required, which entailed basically a self-sacrifice, and initiation was often quite violent and ruthless. This is present among basically every culture, as far as confirming manhood is, or electing to manhood, which is in this sense also divinely transfiguring act in and of itself, like literally changing name, for example. I made that video about, again, sacred royalty, the Sol Invictus, that literally calls to that initiatory space that is to be continuously repeated through ritual, basically. I mean, not the same thing, but the process through which that enactment could happen was, of course, inherent in a specific logic that was not just accessory to that specific initiatory rite. It conferred some certain characteristics that were constantly at play in the rite performer. You find this notion of constantly arising as the king of the living, as the sun, and in this space that was basically distant from man and God, because truly this leadership element was truly supposed to be in divinity in theory, and so in between absolute rule of the universe and humanity. So this seclusion was truly an absconditum that the rest of society could not partake to, right? This is something that continues, for example, so in monastic geography during the early Middle Ages, there is properly a space that is, of course, understood as highly, say, metaphysical one, and so also spiritual in kind, where the fight is unseen by others, but at least proven by the outcome, and still something you can relate. In fact, only through the new existence sparked by initiation, this process rooted, as we've seen, in ritualistic and magical themes of death and rebirth, often requiring an actual sacrifice, not just of the person in a broader sense, but sometimes literally killing people in the process. Just think about how you had to prove to be an effective warrior. In fact, this actually initiated with baptism of fire, or at least of iron, and in fact, like just the way these peoples would see an engagement to begin with was something highly metaphysical, right? Not much just of a sensorial one as we could understand it today. But wanting to recreate, I don't know, a battle for a YouTube video, like it's something that generated visions that brought to those levels of lower fury to be tamed, exactly because that lesser element that normally dominated the plebeians, which, as we've seen, these chthonic cults, was to be utterly dominated, possessed, and retransfigured to bring the hero, like on this mountainside, straight to heaven, to collective benefit. Of course, as we've seen in one of the ancestors, of the same clan that, of course, was augmented first. It wasn't just remember about new people, but the fact that it was basically an old level of totemic soma that people were constantly regenerated from. In the moment of as they were conceived, as they were, true like birth eventually, and their growth in the womb and beyond. So this is really important, and this came notoriously by also acquiring, we were saying before, a new name, language, and roles, and so again, becoming more competent in something else and nearly erasing the memory of the former life. This is yet another aspect that you could actually think to be familiar if you realize, especially as an adult, a bit ahead in age, that there is basically something that you acquired in the greatest heat of your years in terms of accomplishment, etc., that has truly molded you in not in a completely different person, but one that is much more accomplishedly capable of ruling what before seemed so scary in many ways. I'm not going down to things like, I don't know, when you were little, you were scared of dark. Right now, you aren't anymore. But it's along that kind of neurocognitive pattern. Well, this was truly understood in a metaphysical sense. In fact, at that point, through that initiation, one could join the ranks of true men who govern the community. We're talking overwhelmingly military, all right? The Männerbund, the viri, the entire sense of manhood was primarily intended in a military sense, all right? Almost as if participating in a mystery or being inducted into an order of some sort. It was, again, the same way. The whole society was sort of disciplined like this. Also, the plebeians had their own orders. But they didn't have to do with this, as it was perceived by the same plebeians, by the way. This is the interesting part of the story. Standard threshold of celestial kind that basically brought to the recognition of the superior order, as the plebeians were down. Like, we don't have societies here in which, I don't know, the patricians were down and the plebeians weren't, right? That was inconceivable, or at least it was just something, I don't know, we often reference to when we think about a world upside down according to the correct traditional view. For example, the Middle Ages and the Battle of Courtrai. What kind of, world is the one where third estaters butcher down the flower of the French nobility and hang their golden spurs, still, however, at the the Church of the Virgin, as a sacrifice to this great mother, but at that point, obviously, a necessarily integrating part of that same Indo-European patriarchal tradition, but still, but as we also explained, that was not a society where eventually noblemen would stop being in charge. And in this sense, there is also broader metaphysical understanding of this. That is to say, whoever gets at the top at some point has actually always deserved that. Like what happened also with the fall of the ancient regime is that the same people who were to be at the top fell from that standard over the centuries. But still, our societies are ruled by the better element overall, right? It's not like, I don't know, the better, exactly because we don't have essentially a monarchical or unitarily personal rule understood in that sense, like it could be an Augustus. Literally, I don't know, a president literally being responsible for the rule per se. I mean, responsibly, yes, in the face of all, yes, but there are lots of other people that are actually taking decisions because we understand, at least that we managed to fragment this in this power display in other, just like the Romans did, for example, passing from the monarchy to the republic to an extent. And they are delicate topics because they really, as you understand, are relatable, even speaking of contemporary developments. Now, scholars have rightly identified, in fact, this distinction between the patricians and the plebeians as the foundation of all genuine political organization. It's as if, think about all the people who tried to make also in post-ancien regime times this pathetic attempt to describe any other, to draw any other coherent model of description of political and social systems, how and why humans develop societies, or which is also the other notion. Technically, it's actually we fell from heaven with this divine power ingrained, not much rising from the top. But it happens also in the other way. It can't go both ways. But in, let's say, trying to make sense for any other thing, but you had literally tradition telling you how and why it worked that way. Setting a standard, because this is all about setting a standard. Guess who's phobic about standards? Lesser people. And basically our culture overall. According to you, why? Right? Why have we told people, you can be everything, you can be anyone you like if you want, or you really... Because this inherently rejects at least the realization that the universe works in the diametrically opposite fashion. That you cannot have any functional society with this kind of threshold and this kind of division, and one side striving for heaven and the other mostly also antagonizing, but ending up conquered and contributing to the system anyway. It's an incredibly important step. It's a metaphysical step. It's a meta-historical step. And of course, this is a view consistent with earlier discussions about the unique plane of every traditional state, which, again, transcends any unity grounded in some kind of materialistic or simply naturalistic principles. It's not they're not natural or physical or whatever, but they are greater in that they're not deriving from some kind of origin in the netherworld. They derive from God. And so it's completely different from what you've been described as, it's merely just a materialistic, deterministic, relativistic, whatever accident that we exist as a society, so there is no meaning to that. The traditional world up to a couple of hundred years ago understood this in a completely opposite way. Any society has meaning exclusively because of God, right? And again, we studied very, very much like how this began and manifested in many ways. In our videos about military history, we talked about the Männerbund, that is virile groups accessible only through a regeneration that truly made them men and set them apart from others in the community. The Germanic comitatus, the Gallic fiannas, the vers sacrum of the italics, to which end? For wielding authority, the imperium, lesser people today, self-styled conservatives, think that being a conservative means to be involving in an isolationistic, that is to say, the same equation of, say, the leftistic safe space at a greater scale. That's called being a lesser human being. Like, if your culture is inherently isolationistic, it's because your culture is inferior, right? And as such, it's going to be taken over, right? There is nothing more beautiful than dominating the universe. And that's the only thing that a man should strive to achieve. Because everything will fall into that place, all right? And if you fail because you're not good at it, it's because you're less. This happens with countries where if you fail to take over another country, it's not because there is a precondition where countries that invade other countries just per se are failed. Because if they get defeated, those who were attacked are the actual imperial wielders, and the others are lesser peoples. And that's literally how throughout all our history we went. But again, we try to set this idiotic human, that is dirty, standards, as if nothing, there was no other factor in the equation, namely God. The only thing for which anything makes sense, just out of sheer, like if you wonder what the hell is going on in this moment in front of your eyes around you, that's it, right? There's no other, science doesn't explain it, doesn't demonstrate, doesn't even think about doing so. It has nothing to do with that. Here we're talking tradition, not about empiricistic, materialistic, child games. Like, we don't care about those, all right? And this is what, literally, wielding the imperium is what really makes you enjoy unmatched prestige, right? And there is, also a much later awareness of this. For example, on the topic of virility, in its elevated non-naturalistic sense, the Latin term vir is distinct from homo, as we've seen. So again, the distinction between properly that higher fitness to rule, we explained the etymology before, and the dirt of humanity is right there. There is the famous Enlightenment, but you see that Enlightenment wasn't just the Nile tradition. Giambattista Vico wrote the Principi di una scienza nuova, which means principles of a new science. Remember, this is the edition of 1725, the first one. So, again, a world that was truly he was writing from the Holy Roman Empire still, right? So in his work 341, he observed that vir, of course, carried a special dignity because it referred not only to men in contrast to women in patrician marriages and to nobles merely, but also to magistrates. In fact, we've seen them elsewhere. The Dum Viri, Decem Vir made an entire video explaining the Indo-European etymology of the Roman political institutional system of law, magistrates. You think just about the bureaucratic state of the contemporary viewer that think about, civil thing. This concept were purely based all in a military religious sense. The same goes for the priests, Quindicam Viri, Viginti Viri, and judges, the Kempte Vir. So we're not looking at a system that is celebrating some specialized function without any further merit. Just like the right is not the right just because you materially do something. It's what you vehiculate in these actions that are designed by your own power, right? And Vico says, so that with this word vir was conveyed wisdom, priesthood, and kingship. So it's the primarily unitary sense of divine power in one that was in fact owned by the monarch in principle. Romulus, namely, that also is the guy that literally transfigures in a blaze to heaven, in this sense confers divinity to the Roman race. And which Vico says, as demonstrated earlier, were unified in the persons of first fathers in the state of families. And again, because he's talking about the patricians, so again, in a time where monarchy was already split, but as you understood just right now, he was very well aware of the fact that kinship, in fact, was there, and they were just inheriting it from the previous model that entailed that. It was only later times that aristocracy, like royalty and other institutions, assumed a purely secular and political character, as we intended today, right? I remember once I was watching a YouTube video about the British royals, and it was about Queen Elizabeth II, and you find this weird comments like with hundreds of likes from hotly debated topics, videos. What's her purpose? This was a British person. I can't find any proper insult that wouldn't make me banned from YouTube for this kind of... Let's leave aside, of course, the fact that in historical perspective, after the 17th century, of course, the English monarchy is a joke, and that, of course, like the idea of a queen in itself is problematic. Speaking of original virility, but it doesn't matter. It still fits. It's still plausible, and especially for our times, I doubt that a person writing those things has any metaphysical worth compared to a woman like Elizabeth II. That, by the way, had a motto like Semper Eadem, which is one of the most perennial concepts of the doctrine of the two natures that you can find. So, if you don't see the purpose to this, and of course your institutions are merely a matter of, humans are the measure of things, well, humans can't basically trash themselves immediately in the compactor of humus to be, how do you say, recycled, just like the civilization of the mother telluric, constant child-devouring system to respit and degenerate you into nothingness really worked, right? With living terrorized by looking at the dirt and just thinking how much it's left before you pass away and decompose into nothingness. Well, that's exactly what the point is. European identity and tradition are incompatible with lesser people, to the extent that these lesser people are not dignified by a higher order. And this higher order largely lacks. So, again, many people are dignified by institutions to a degree, but definitely not as the ancients, to the degree the ancients believed, and we really lost too much along the way. So initially, actually, aristocracy rested on traits of character and lineage, of honor, courage, and loyalty, as seen in the noblesse de paix, as opposed to the noblesse de cour, de robe. Eventually, a plebeian notion of aristocracy arose, the one that you read on history books today, rejecting the legitimacy of blood and tradition, which are everything, especially were everything to people that lived, again, as close as this, this nonsense was basically inculcated just to indoctrinate the masses to do something that before could be done without even, has anybody achieved the Roman Empire? Again, that was definitely not an age of mass society. What has the mass society achieved, actually, in terms of form, other than substance? You see, people don't even suspect this. Nobody literally ever told them. It's not like they heard it somewhere from the family, from the school, from the university, from the church even. Nobody talks about this anymore at large. Maybe the church a bit, but even that depends which church and how, really. Because the meaning is all here. As I'm making these videos in 2025, you don't know my background, but yeah, I'm a 20th century person, so I'm not immortal. I have been generated in a later time compared to the age of years after the golden age. So unfortunately, but you may never know how this is going to go. Yeah, I mean, as I know this stuff, you can know it. That, of course, another step is enacting that, and that's also actually the greater problem. But if there is not even a specific premise for this, how can you politically or socially enact this? Morally, culturally, how do you actually get into that initiation? Maybe Schwerpunkt helps, but of course it takes a gigantic work, and it simply doesn't end to a silly video like this one can be compared to God. Like otherwise, a video that is God compared to anything else existing on YouTube. I like my modesty because, of course, we're made of that as well. Now, the shift also encompassed the so-called aristocracy of culture, or intellectuals, by the way. That was truly like, remember, a baggage, a treasure of wisdom, of knowledge, of, like the idea, again, of vision, of capacity of enacting, without even, like the Wei Wu Wei, right? Or that we looked at in Taoism, in other bits in the Chinese way to tradition. Speaking, in fact, of those like of the ancients, of properly of the ancestors, and how they practice, because there is this tension between, since equality does not exist, but in God, of course, any person is, even when conservatively or better traditionally inclined, is either more contemplative or more active, right? And we're both always at the same time, but we may specialize. Like when you think about the body politics, also having to be cohesive, you have, just like with men and women, etc., differences being always qualitative, but becoming complementary, and therefore increasing strength and power. All right, so this is not merely a coincidence. Unfortunately, this was also lost in the traditional meaning, and when you look at, for example, what emerged on the fringes of bourgeois society, you realize that, yes, today we were brought to admire, if anything, some figures, or revering them, professors, people who actually know their deal, whatever, but that do not actually reach the thresholds of this complementarity, do not actually go as far as high. Like they may compensate, again, the various sort of gaps of their knowledge by integrating with others constantly and being into that kind of fight and fray, but not really even getting the presuppositions how to make things work. Again, how do we teach history? What do we teach history like? These are big questions. They can't quite simply be bypassed. I think that in these videos, I am pointing out a major flaw in the current world and in storytelling compared to what we concretely know about how these societies really work. There is an interesting anecdote that is the one surrounding the Analphabet wegen des Hohen Adels, the illiterate due to high nobility, which was a humorous reply of this prominent German patrician during a census led at the time of Frederick the Great, or, for example, the traditional view of English lords described as by one as versing low, knowledgeable, and even if unable to read, which of course is, it's not about the intellect, it's about the spirit, right? This is the distinction that we should really make. Like the same higher elements of the nobility of Europe are able to be, rather than to simply reduce everything to a merely contemplative side of the story that eventually is going to degenerate without further action, without further combination of these two elements. Both things will degenerate into different things. There is a lot of extremism that is really to the end of itself, and instead leadership entail the balance, right? So when you look at the clear ontological and existential distinctions, you realize that the aristocratic ideal and its legitimacy is something that transcends merely even just the lifestyle per se, or one element of the same. It has all to do with the wall, with the more unitarily Catholic capacity of putting everything together, of knowing more. This is what noble education was all before. Think about how many pseudo-conservatives today claim that basically you have to, I don't know, just to study technical subjects to be a man of some sort. Basically, they're teaching how to be a slave by letting the slave presume that they are hero, like Nietzsche said, like we'll think to be heroes, we'll wish that, but we're actually all slaves at the same time. And he was dealing exactly with this specific problem. The nobleman covers everything. Look at what Prince Eugen collected in his library at the Belvedere in Vienna. Look at how gigantic properly that moment, by the way, is quite interesting and fitting historically, because it's really a moment of great comprehensive effort that eventually fails in the 18th century with the just rigid, say, essentially the deterministic categorization that the Encyclopédie did, which is how also largely, again, we think today, because that's the same moment from which, again, we began to load aristocracy, even just as a concept, not just as the individual shortcomers, let's say, that were guillotined, because of the everything it is deserved, right, in the eyes of God, exactly because of the lack of imperium that would have prevented them to end up in that way otherwise. And I would say this is so self-evident. You see, when you open a history book, it's not like anybody tells you about the 18th century in that fashion, right? This is not about making some nostalgic appreciation of the ancient regime. Again, if you study those pages, you realize why things went the way they did. But it's the difference between form and substance. This is just a substantial history. There's no form to it. There is no vision of the fact that this is a collective tragedy. It's not like the victory of the people or whatever, again, lesser people must pretend to think they have any relevance whatsoever in the world. Today, people don't even think they can survive. They don't even think about the second death. They don't know that there is eternal life that is accessible in an actual sense. It's nothing. It's the death of everything. So this is the huge problem. We have the possibility of literally reaching the stars, reaching for the stars and actually succeeding in doing so. And in a metaphysical sense, of course, and we understand nothing of the literally explicit things that the ancients are telling us through their work, because we decided to banish that interpretation and to raise our children in a world that nobody knows how it should sustain itself on its own legs. This is really a massive issue. And of course, the tradition outlined earlier in time does persist, right? It's not like it's disappeared. Nothing is over, again, as long as there is life. It's weakened. It's, again, aberratingly altered. But, for example, chivalric nobility, right? This is something still living banally in the not so banally in the great medieval orders that in part still exist, but they're also, of course, affected by the same problems of this era. There is a partially ascetic and sacred character still of the original medieval one, and we'll have to make videos explaining what that consisted of, not just the great Ghibelline tradition, but truly how power could be, a divine power could be manifested through the practice of this order and the cingulum militaris that represented it. And you understand that because nobility drew its sanctity not from itself, but from an external source, right? It is true that as we've seen, divinity was bestowed on them just by blood, right? But there is also there a composition. For example, the clergy was to sanctify this because it was believed that at that point, after Augustus, basically, and that's also why Christianity happens basically the divine standard was unattainable for single rulers, and so it had to be a more cooperatively estate-based business. This already existed before telling the truth, but it's also about the lack of a specific leader that these guys were trying to invert. And so there's also like a clergy that is in itself demilitarized. Not always, actually. We made videos about medieval episcopal, forces, and in fact how bishops went at war as knights. So made a military historical unit series about that. This is notorious, right? But at large, the clergy did not really. The Pope could move its divisions. They even had their own army. But just by directing the lay forces across Europe, it actually was a cooperatively successful way. That's how Jerusalem was retaken in 1099. So it did work, but to a different degree compared to, simply how the Romans walk into the Levant, for that matter. And that's also something that does not apply to specifically Christianity, because again, there are always other typical lesser cultures, etc., out there that think, instead we are the better. No, like this is actually the best. Where in the European tradition was convoyed, the other societies were collapsing in far worse ways, and that's why the Europeans, and especially at that point, still got it in very similar ways to before, but still to this day, more than any other, still on the basis of the same legacy, which is also something we should really recover. I'm talking Europeans here, of course, also as their offspring, because as we said before, a genetic principle is not really debatable here, traditionally wise. So to be doctrinally correct, right? But indeed, like the medieval clergy was basically removed from the spirituality of the original elites, if at least we understand the original elites being both military and priestly at the same time. And that's, of course, a very important distinction that at some point we will have to take into consideration, because, again, there was a investiture controversy for a reason. And I think traditionalists always pick the negative of it. They confuse the consequence with the cause. This was actually a moment of great boom, right? The investiture controversy was also the peak of the same European power, in the same church, in the same knighthood, so to say. So it's not in contrast at all, right? Something would have gone bad for one. In function of the other, would have really not favored the other. Instead, they went in parallel, right? And that's also what you want to appreciate in the moment in which you realize that it was a complementary system as well, and that people at the time understood it in this sense. Otherwise, again, it would have never worked in that way. Understanding tradition is not easy, right? It's not really immediate. It's not really the sense of a mere ghost, so to say, but it's also something you must cultivate a bit. Because again, people's minds are completely de-habituated to deal with the topic, to actually understand what it means more. So again, I don't really see other ways, but at least approaching the topic in this fashion and then reasoning further the more ahead we go. Because as you understand, we have also a lot of information here. And again, our videos about history of religion are pretty much out there in very powerful ways, and I think we should also exploit them better. I created by the way, a specific playlist about the Imperial Catholic tradition, but what impressed me was rather the views. Excuse me, I've had some technical problems, fortunately not affecting the videos. I'll be resolving next week, hopefully. So sometimes I'm more distracted than I should be. Never say, things are going well. The other day was saying, okay, we come back on the American Civil War because finally found the time and tranquility. And then, things happen. Technology is really stupid. Technology is never the way, and it's a sin to depend on technology. Here, if you search for Imperial Catholic tradition, YouTube sends you other stupid content that has nothing to do with that, just because they think they can make more views by that. I have to add Schwerpunkt to get to the playlist. I mean, I give you specific information, and not even with this, immediately you get the first result correct. At least there are my works here. And I actually created this, and we're getting there. 320 views. I think this, I don't remember when I created this playlist. Unfortunately, there is no such thing like a date on the playlist. But people are watching this stuff, which means that, the more we make and the more it can attract, which is really good and really where I was going for. Let me check history of religion. Schwerpunkt. This even more, 1700. My God, this is a recent playlist. This is a fairly recent playlist in creation, and really, it's really getting somewhere, and I'm really, really grateful for that. I hope that this content is an avenue also for reaching the other, because it's here I have also other communication stuff. Again, slowed things down a bit, but that's also how you make these videos. And unfortunately, again, time is what it is. Everything is what it is, and it's not easy to get anywhere. The way we would like to. But again, let's for today stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.